First Samuel chapter 30 this morning. I just want to give you a couple of thoughts about where we were last week. In 1 Samuel chapter 29, we turned away from Saul's response to the threat of the Philistines. Remember what's going on. The Philistine army has decided they want to attack Israel. Obviously, the Philistines are Gentiles. They don't worship Yahweh. They're pagans. They have their own set of gods that they worship, Dagon being their chief god. They are not who the Jews are. So you've got Gentile unbelievers making war against Jewish believers. That's what's going on here. And of course, David is among the Jewish believers, but David has built a problem in his life. David has built this problem. So in 1 Samuel 29, what we're shifting away from is looking at how Saul responded to this. In chapter 28, remember Saul went to the witch of Endor. She went to the dark. She went to demonism because the Lord wouldn't answer. And Samuel had died and he had cut off all the mediums and the spiritists from the land. David doesn't do that. So we move while the Philistines are threatening. In chapter 29, we move to focus on what David was doing in preparation for this war. The Philistines are marching northward to make war with Israel. They're trying to get up to the Jezreel Valley, which is near modern-day Haifa. Haifa is the port city where the Jezreel Valley opens up. So the Philistines are marching northward against Israel because they want to fight the Jews, the chosen people of God, Israel. And David, the Jew, the next king of Israel, is marching alongside them. David is in a horrible situation. What is he doing marching with the Gentile pagan, anti-Yahweh pagans? He's in a pickle, and only God can get him out of this pickle. King Achish of Gath has brought David with him to fight against Israel. Remember, Philistia, the land of Philistia, has 5 major cities, and Gath is one of them. And the king of this particular city, his name is Achish, and he's made friends with David because David's lied to him, he's manipulated him, he's deceived him. And Achish thinks, David's one of us. David has turned against Israel. David has turned against King Saul. David is trustworthy. He's loyal to the Philistines now, even though he killed the Philistine giant 15 years ago. We can trust David. So Achish, this crazy Philistine king, has brought David with him. Bring your 600 men. Let's go fight against your people. This is a crazy story. The other 4 lords, I tell you, Philistia has 5 major cities. Well, the other 5 cities have their own kings. And those kings of these Philistine cities think Achish's judgment is horribly flawed. And they demand that David return to Philistia at once. There's no way that we're going to go into battle with this Jewish champion. This is insanity. We're going to fight the Jews, and you've brought a Jew into battle with us. This will never work, Achish, your judgment. How can you think this? And so the other 4 Philistine kings demand that David be sent back where he was from. So Achish commands David and sends David back to Ziklag, to the city in Israel. Now we move into chapter 30, so turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30 with me. And what we see in chapter 30 is what David finds when he returns to his city Ziklag. Simple as that. He's gone into battle. He's marching to battle with the Philistine army. The rest of the Philistine kings realize this is insanity to have a Jew with us. You must send him back. Achish, wherever David is staying in your territory, send him back there. We will not go into battle against Israel with this man in our ranks. So David marches back home. It takes him 3 days to get there. And when he gets back to this Philistine city of Ziklag, this is what he finds. Chapter 30, verse 1. Then it happened, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, that the Amalekites, we've seen a lot of this name recently, that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag. So the Negev is the desert of Israel, the southern desert of Israel. So they're fighting the Jews in the Negev, in the desert. And they're also making raids on Ziklag, which is a Philistine city. So the Amalekites are not only fighting Israel by making raids into the Negev, but they're also fighting Philistia by making raids into David's temporary home, Ziklag. So the Amalekites, their problem. And they have made a raid on the Negev and the Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. Now this is where David had lived for a year and 4 months. Ziklag. It's where David's wives live. It's where David's children live. And now we read that the Amalekites, while David was gone, we'll talk more about this, but think about this. Who caused this problem while David was marching, acting like he was in obedience to the Philistines? While David left, the Amalekites came in and attacked his city, captured his wives and his children and all his 600 men, all their wives and children, and have taken them into captivity, and they burned the city with fire. Whose fault is that? So the Amalekites here, not good people. As I just said, as soon as David left town, they attacked the city of Ziklag, and they burned its structures to the ground. Whatever was there, they burned it. But that's not the worst thing they did. Look at verse 2. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone. Now that's the grace of God in action. In warfare, you usually go in and you do what? You kill everything that breathes. But not this time. For whatever reason, whether they wanted to make the women slaves, the children slaves, whether they wanted to use the women as concubines, whether they wanted to sell them as slaves to Egyptians or to other people, we don't know. But for whatever reason, God's grace was in action here, and God allowed David's families not to die. They didn't kill them. They took them as captives without killing anyone, and they carried them off, and they went their way. Remember what we learned in 1 Samuel 28, how Samuel had been called up by Saul from the dead. Remember? Remember one of the things that Samuel scolded Saul about was how Saul was disobedient to Yahweh's orders concerning these people, the Amalekites. Now, just a tiny bit of history to see who are these people that have captured David's family. Remember, this is what we saw of how Saul was disobedient. King Saul was disobedient to what Yahweh told him to do with the Amalekites, and that's why these people are still a problem on earth for David. It says in 1 Samuel 15 verse 2, "Thus says Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel." These are the Amalekites, the people of Amalek. God had decided, God had decreed that the Amalekites are going to die, all of them. And God was going to use Saul and the Jews to kill the Amalekites, to punish them for what they had done. What had they done? Look what it says, how Amalek set himself against Israel on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. After the 10 plagues and Israel leaves Egypt in the Exodus, you can read about it in Exodus chapter 12 and following. As Israel is leaving Egypt, this 2 million person throng leaving Egypt, Amalek came out and made war against Israel. And God didn't forget it. He just tabled it for a proper time. Well, the proper time has come. And now, all these years later, God is ready to punish Amalek for what they had done. How many years have gone by? Anybody have a guess? I'll give you some dates to help you along. 1446, Moses leaves Egypt. All Israel behind him, 1446. How long was Israel disobedient and in the wilderness? 40 years. Because there's the first 40 years. How long was the period of the judges? 300 years. How long has Saul been king? How long was Saul's reign, King Saul? How many years did he reign? 40 years. So how many years are we talking about? 400 or so years? You think God forgets. God should have punished those people, Amalek, for what they did to Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3? What does it say? I will bless those who bless you, and what else? And curse those who curse you? What about God's promise? Did God not keep His promise? Did God not keep His word? Why hasn't God punished Amalek? Why didn't He punish them on that day when they came against Israel as Israel was leaving Egypt? What's the answer? It wasn't proper in God's timing. God's plan had He had a different plan. The God who knows the beginning from the end, the God who calls Himself the Alpha and the Omega, that God gets to decide timing. He knows what we don't know. And so it has taken some 400 years for God to come around, but now in 1 Samuel 15, He says it's time. Because of what Amalek did, and how he set himself against Israel as Israel was leaving Egypt, now he says, now 400 or so years later, now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. It's amazing when you think, we pray on Wednesday nights, and I know you pray all the time, and we've got this unspoken prayer list, and every day I can tell you right now, it's Diane, Terry, Gail, Amy, Melba, Liz, Kale. We know the list. We know who they are because it's the same list every week. How long have you been praying for that? Whoever you are that has an unspoken request, how long have you been praying? And you may think and lose heart and grow weary and think this God doesn't listen. He either doesn't listen, doesn't care, or something. You may lose heart. But I love that God puts these things in the Bible because God takes His time. And when His time is up, evil will be dealt with every single time. There is no forgetting. And so here we have, 400 years later, don't give up. Keep praying your prayers. God hears. The time isn't right. He gets to choose the time. We have to trust Him that He knows everything. 400 years later, God has finally levied His judgment. His judgment was immediate. I will curse those who curse you. And Amalek, when Israel was coming out of Egypt, they had a curse placed on them. But in God's time, it took 400 years for Him to be ready to punish. That's God's time. But now it's time. Go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. It's time. So what did Saul do? Saul's been given very direct orders to go and destroy Amalek. Amalek should not be a problem to David. I'm telling you all this because the Amalekites who have just come and captured David's wives and David's children should not be a threat to David, because his father-in-law, the king of Israel, should have killed everything that breathed if only he would have obeyed God. 1 Samuel chapter 30 doesn't exist. But Samuel didn't obey God. And so the Amalekites are still on earth, still causing trouble, still warring against Israel. 1 Samuel 15, same chapter, a couple of verses later, in verse 7, it says, So Saul defeated the Amalekites. He obeyed God, but he partially obeyed God. He didn't kill everything. It says, from Havilah, as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt, it's telling you where they were, these Amalekites. He captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Is that right or wrong? Is that an obedience to what God told him to do? Did God say kill everything that breathes? Yes. What does the word alive mean? Dead or alive? It's not dead. Saul has not killed everything that breathes. Saul has left people there alive. That's not what God told him to do. This is the problem in 1 Samuel chapter 30. Disobedience to God causes problems, not just for Saul, but for others that sin. You got to understand how our sins have fingers, and when we choose to sin against God, almost every time, I won't say every time, but almost every time, your disobedience and my disobedience affects other people also. It's not just me. My sinful life affects those around me. It affects my church. It affects my relationships. It affects others. It's not just me that I'm harming by sinning. And here we see Saul's sin, so many decades ago, continues to haunt David. So Saul defeats the Amalekites, but he captured the king Agag alive. He utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword, but still you have this one king who's alive. And that has caused all this problem. The people have repropagated. I'm sure there are others he didn't kill also. And this people has risen up again. They have a mortal enemy in Israel now. And so they come to Israel and capture the people and burn the city. I think it's interesting that they didn't kill the people, because you would think in their memories, because they knew that this was David's city. Let's make no mistake. David, I'll show you a verse in just a minute. David had been making raids on the Amalekites here recently. And so they knew that this is where David was. But you would think after David's father-in-law, the king of Israel, Saul, had killed so many of their own people only 40 years ago, you would think that the Amalekites would come in and want to kill all of David's people. But by God's grace, they captured them alive. They didn't kill them. They didn't slaughter them in retribution. They captured them alive. It tells me that God is very clearly involved in keeping the Amalekites from killing David's family. So the Amalekites are still giving David trouble because King Saul didn't put them to rest the way he should have. 11 years have gone by. David's been chased, been haunted by these Amalekites. Saul's been given in trouble for 11 years. The Amalekites have continued to be trouble because Saul didn't obey Yahweh when he had the chance. If he would have, there would be no Amalekites left on earth. This is what Samuel told Saul. I started this by saying, remember when Saul, through the witch of Endor, had Samuel come back from Sheol? We talked about that. But Samuel has a message for him, and part of his message is, you will not win tomorrow because of what you did and how you disobeyed God concerning Amalek. You should have killed them all, but you didn't. And so Samuel says in 1 Samuel 28:18, as you did not obey Yahweh and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, God's a promise keeper. I will curse those who curse you. God was ready to curse them, but you refused to obey, Saul. Because you did not obey the Lord, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. So we see Saul's disobedience to Yahweh continues to cause trouble on Israel. It's not a personal sin. Most of our personal sins have creeping fingers that go out and affect those around us. And this man Saul's sin is affecting David and 600 men that are fighting with David, their wives and their children, all because of one disobedient decision to not do what Yahweh said and destroy the Amalekites. One decision, still wreaking havoc. What about David? What about his past with the Amalekites? I told you that he's been making raids on them. In this year and 4 months that David lived in Philistia, he just didn't live there and enjoy the passage of time. He was active. He was preparing his kingdom. He knows he's going to be the next king of Israel. He knows Saul is getting old. He knows eventually that he'll take the throne. So what he's doing is annihilating these southern kingdom enemies of Israel, and he's making raids down there. It says the number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. While he was there, what was he doing? Well, the Bible tells us. Now David and his 600 men went up, and they raided the Geshurites and the Girzites, and here they are, the Amalekites. So David had been in active warfare against these people. Skirmishes, little battles, little hit and runs, going into their towns, destroying, taking captive, whatever. He had been engaged in this with these people, the Amalekites. For they were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. So David was actively attacking Amalekites. They were part of this people that he had been systematically exterminating, if you will, to let Israel, the southern border of the promised land, have peace. David was taking care of that. Saul wouldn't. David was taking care of it. So they have been at war with David, and as soon as David left town, what do you think the Amalekites do? They're going to retaliate. They're going to come after David's people. And so they did. This is a man-made problem. The first person who messed this up, King Saul. He should have annihilated these people from the planet in obedience to God's direct command. He didn't. The second person that's at fault in this debacle is who? David. What in the world is David doing in Philistine territory? Why isn't David living in the land of Judah? Because David was fearful of Saul, and he decided, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding. I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm going to go to the Philistines, and I'll find peace there. Outside of the peaceful land of promise, I'm going to go find peace in Philistine territory. And while I'm there, I'm going to lie to the king. I'm going to deceive the king. I'm going to manipulate their king into thinking I'm on his side and I've turned against my people Israel. Disaster. Disaster. This problem of the Amalekites is made by Saul and made by David. And God has to come in to solve it. How many problems in your life are caused by you? What percentage? 80? 90? I mean, let's be real here. And who always comes in? Faithful, everlasting faithfulness, our God, sees our weaknesses, understands our sinfulness, and still renews His mercy in the morning, still works things out as we foul them up. What a gracious and merciful God we serve. He does it for David. Of course He does. He does it for me. He does it for David. Does it for you. He's a long-suffering God, isn't He? When David and his men, we're in verse 3, when David and his men came to the city, Ziklag, 3 days' journey, he's gone back. Behold, it was burned with fire. Their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. They're living, but they're gone. Imagine I don't know what the word is, but imagine going back to your house and finding your children missing. You have no idea where they are. How are they going to find them in the vastness of the regions of Philistia? How are they going to find their families? How do they know which direction they went? Who knows the beginning from the end again? What's His name? His name is Yahweh. So who has to give David information about where his family is? How would David ever find them if God didn't tell him? So what does God do? He tells him. Just such a giving God. David's caused this whole problem, and God, one by one, little by little, is undoing David's problem. Merciful, wonderful God. So his families are gone. And David and all the people who were with him, the 600 men, all lifted their voices and they wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now, as we go through this chapter, I want to highlight some of David's character qualities. Now, this David, over an 11-year period, has been built into a leader by God. It doesn't look like he's making great decisions here. And some of the decisions he makes are bad because he's what you call human and sinful. But his inner character has been built by God over 11 years. And while we see an imperfect David in his actions and his lines and his manipulations with King Achish, we still see a leader has been built by Yahweh over the last 11 years. I just want to show you as we go through some of his character qualities, some of his leadership character qualities. And the first one is right here in chapter 4, his empathy. Empathy, E-M-P-A-T-H-Y. He feels for others. He understands the loss, not only of himself, his wives, his children are gone, but he empathizes with the 600 men he's with us and their pain also, and all of them wept together. He bears other people's burdens. He's not arrogant and standoffish. He's in the boat with them. He's a leader of men, and he's ready to lead Israel. Not a perfect leader, and as you know, David, in the rest of David's story, he will continue making mistakes, some of them absolutely grand David's mistakes. But every time he falters, he turns back to God, and every time God is there with open arms to welcome him back. David, a man after God's own heart. David has been built into a man with leadership qualities. First leadership quality, empathy. They lifted up their voices together and they wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Why were they so scared? Why were they so weepy? Where were their wives? Did David have any idea where his wife was? Where his children were? He didn't know. All he knew was that I've been foolish. I can't imagine the weight of the decision. I've been lying to this king. I've been manipulating this king. I've been deceiving this king, so much so that this king asks me to go into battle with him and travel north away from the protection of my city and my family. I foolishly went with him thinking somehow I could work this out. I could get out of this ruse, this lie I've been living. I left my family unprotected, and now they're gone. I don't have any idea where they went, but I know whose fault this is. I know absolutely and for certain, if I would have been here, there would have been war. There wouldn't have been captivity. I would have defeated those Amalekites the way I have been for the last 16, 18 months. But I let my guard down. I thought I was thinking more clearly than I was. I was deceived in myself, and I have brought this on myself. And I've got 600 men whose wives and children are gone also. I did this. Verse 5 says, Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail. Remember the great Abigail from 1 Samuel chapter 25. The one who saved the day when David wanted to kill all of her husband Nabal's men for not giving them food, a day's rations. Abigail has to step in to save the day. Where's Abigail? She's gone. He doesn't know where she is. Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelitess. David has bigger problems. Verse 6 says, Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered. Why would they be embittered? Why would the 600 soldiers that have been traveling with David, who've given their lives to David over the last several years, why would they be embittered against David? Why would they want to pick up stones to kill their leader now? Each one because of his sons and his daughters. Now, these 600 soldiers that were fighting with David were mad enough to stone him, and I would say it's probably because they clearly understood that this entire ruse, the lying, the manipulations, the deception, this is going to come back to bite you one day. These aren't fools blindly following a man. These are men who would make up David's mighty 30 men one day. These are men that would rule his army with him. These are thinkers. And they knew, you're messing this up, guy. You'd marched us in the battle with the Philistines, and we come back and all our people are gone. What do you deserve? Is that leadership? What you deserve is to be stoned with stones. They knew where the fault lied. They knew that this was David's fault. They absolutely knew our loved ones are missing. We don't know where they are. They could be dead for all we know. I mean, imagine what's going on in Gaza with the captives that have been there in Gaza for so many days, months, years now. And the parents not knowing where they are, how they are. Imagine this. So these men are so embittered towards David that they're ready to pick up stones. Forget being the king. Forget Goliath. Forget all those wonderful things. Forget our wives singing that song about you great as here comes Saul who slays his thousands and David his 10,000s. Forget all that. We will bury you under a pile of stones. Look what you have done. How does David respond to this? In his own personal agony of not knowing where his family is, the personal agony of not knowing where his men's families are, the personal agony of knowing these men who I am in charge of, who I lead, have turned against me because of my foolishness, my decisions. Where does David turn to? Where does he turn to? Who does he turn to? Well, he turns to God. David, it says, strengthened himself in the Lord Yahweh, his God. This shows the second character quality, leadership quality of David that I'll highlight this morning, faith. He had faith that even though I have messed this up, and I mean big time, if God wills, He can make good from this. Yahweh can fix this. In His mercy, Yahweh can make this right. So what does David do when his life is on the line? Now imagine this. If you've been to any of the night sessions, we've been talking about Satan, and now we've been talking about Satan and his war against the promised deliverer of Adam's sinful race. God promised Satan in the garden and Adam and Eve, because they were there also, that I will save Adam's sinful race one day by sending a deliverer, the seed of the woman. And Satan has been trying to stop that from happening. He tried to stop Jesus from coming to earth. And imagine Satan's joy. Satan, the father of all lies, the deceiver, the accuser. Imagine Satan's joy. I would think, no doubt, with David here, watching what's going on, trying to do what he can to stop the seed of the woman from coming into human history, to stop Jesus Christ from being born. Imagine how close Satan got on this day when David's own men wanted to kill him. If I can kill David, I win. Because Jesus is in the line of King David. If I can kill David, I win. Solomon and Nathan, his sons through Bathsheba later, have not been born yet. If Satan can kill David, and he's right at the cusp of it, imagine men carrying stones right at the cusp of stopping God's plan, with men trying to kill David and wipe him off the earth. But here's God to pick up David, dust him off, confess your sins to me, let's get right again, and let's fix this. Such a merciful God. And what does David have? Faith in God. I've messed this up, Lord. It's me again. It's all my fault. But I have faith that as you have before, you will see me through this. He's the promised King of Israel. If he goes with humility and faith to God, God will fix this, and he does. Verse 7, David said, how does David turn to God? It says, David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, who was killed by Saul. He says to Abiathar, please bring me the ephod. And so Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Now, just a couple of pictures. I think it's important to go back and remember these things when we get to them every now and then. Remember what this ephod is. Remember who the high priest is. Remember how Israel worshiped God in these days. There was no Jerusalem yet. It was called Jebus. The city of Jerusalem did not exist yet, as the Jews would own it. There was no temple on the Temple Mount, as there would be under King Solomon. What there was in these days was a traveling tent, the tabernacle. And this is where Israel would worship God. This is where God resided, where His glory, where His personal presence was with Israel. That tent in the wilderness had certain things in it, certain Jewish things that you run into all the time. And one of those was the menorah. We'd call it the menorah. It was the golden lampstand that the priests would light every day with purely beaten olive oil. That was would have been very fragrant. Sometimes I've got a little thing. I forget what you call it off the top of my head. What is it? The little clay thing that you burn the oil in. What is that thing called? It's not just called a pot. What's it called? It'll come to me. But I have one, and sometimes I fill my thing up with olive oil. And olive oil burns with a very, very particular scent. It's a good smell. And so it would have been very fragrant inside the tabernacle in the holy place. Not only did the priest come in, it shows the priest not lighting. You may think he's lighting the lights. He's not. The lights never went out. He was filling up the oil. The lamps burned continuously. Also inside that tent, there was the altar of incense, where the pure beaten frankincense would go be put inside this censer here, and it would be burned, a representation of the prayers of people, the prayers of mankind, the Jews going up to God. There was also on the right this table of showbread, where there would be 12 pieces of bread, one for each of the tribes of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 pieces of bread. Every Sabbath day, the priests would come in and take these old pieces of bread and put 12 new pieces of bread, and they would be recycled every week, and the priestly families would eat that bread. These are the pieces of bread that when David and his men were hungry, they came by and they asked the priest, "Do you have any food?" Just recently, in 1 Samuel, "Do you have any food?" And the priest said, "We don't have any bread but the consecrated bread, the bread of the holy place, the bread of the showbread, of the table of showbread, and this is the bread that David and his men ate." All these things are inside this tent. This tent was God's dwelling place. It was God's holy place. It's divided into thirds. This is a different picture of the tent. I'm just trying to give you, to put it in your minds again, what are we talking about here when David asks for the ephod? What ephod? What's the significance of this ephod? It's a holy relic of Israel. So inside the tent, you see here in this other picture where the animals were, you see right here a slain animal with blood coming out of its neck. It would be burned at the bronze altar here. The priest would go up the ramp. There's a bronze grate there. It was always had fire under it, always burning burning the animals. The blood would pour out from under it. Some of the blood would be taken inside and sprinkled on the holy things, certainly the altar of incense. But inside that tent, if you can imagine, there's a marcation, there's a line, there's a veil that stops you being able to see the front of the tent from what's in the back of the tent. There were two separate sections. And the front section was called the holy place. These are the things I've just shown you. The menorah, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. And then there was that great veil. And that veil could only be passed. Somebody tell me, how many days a year could a priest go past that veil into the next section? There was only one day a year. And the only man that could go back there was the high priest. Only one man on all the earth. Now imagine this, the holiness of a place like this. Only one man in all of humanity on the earth at that time, only one man could pass through that curtain into the presence of God, and he could only do it one day a year. And that's the high priest wearing his ephod. A cutaway view of what's behind the curtain. Sorry for the cartoonishness of the picture, but these things are hard to find. You see again this picture with the curtain opened, peeled back, and you see what's behind there. What is that chest called? What does the Bible call it? What did God name it? The Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Contract. The Ark of the Promise. This is the box that represents the promise that God made to Israel. And on top of this box, there's a lid called the mercy seat. And the mercy seat is pounded of one piece of gold. Imagine the block of gold they had, because those angels, the cherubim with their wings outspread over, were all hammered out of one piece of gold, the same piece of gold, according to God's directions to Moses in the book of Exodus. On top of that mercy seat, you see that cloud. Who's in the cloud? Well, that's God. Because God said, I will be with Israel, and it's from the mercy seat where I will reside, where I will speak to Israel. I will reside there as a cloud, a pillar of cloud by day, and at night it turned into a pillar of fire, a cloud with fire in it. God would always be with Israel from the mercy seat. Oh, I'd like to take you down that further history. I'll just say this, that in the book of Ezekiel, one day, as sad as it is to contemplate, that pillar of cloud was lifted off of the mercy seat, and that pillar of cloud, the presence of God, left Israel. You want to disobey me? You want to worship your false gods? You want to profane my name? You want to make idols that I told you not to make? I'll let you, but I'll leave you too. I'm not going to beg you to worship me. And when you reject me, I'll reject you. And that cloud of pillar was taken off of the mercy seat, and God exited out of the front of the temple, and God exited from the east gate of the temple, and God disappeared into heaven. And the Shekinah glory would never come back to earth again until the Shekinah glory came in a physical personage. What was his name? Jesus of Nazareth. And what did they do when Jesus of Nazareth came to earth? The Shekinah, no longer in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, but now in a human body, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Israel, has come. God the Son, the Creator of the world, has come to save Israel from her sins. And what do they do yet again? They reject Him. So that what does He have to do? He has to leave to the east. You go to the book of Acts, you see Jesus Christ taken up into the clouds. Look at this picture, same imagery. Jesus Christ taken up into the clouds to leave to heaven. The Shekinah glory gone again. Will He come back? Of course He will. As we wait in joyful hope for the coming of our Savior Jesus Christ. He'll come back for the church at the rapture. 7 years after that, He'll come back for Israel at the second coming. The ephod. David calls for the ephod. One day a year, on the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month of the year, the Jewish year, on the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, you may know it as. Yom Kippur. That is the one day on a Jewish calendar when only the high priest could go back into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of the Shekinah glory, and very humbly, quietly, peaceably, gratefully sprinkle blood on the mercy seat and leave for another year. Let me ask you a question. You go to Israel now. After this event, after the tabernacle had done its job, God would call out Solomon, David's son, to build him a permanent place in Jerusalem. No longer a tent, now a temple. And in that temple, they made new furniture. The Ark of the Covenant was the same one. The menorah was the same one, but they added to it. I think there were 7 menorahs in the temple. There were multiples of these things, not just one each. Except for the ark, there was only one. I tell you in the book of Ezekiel that as the temple still stood, one day that cloud, God's presence, left Israel. And soon after that, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians would roll into Jerusalem, destroy the city and destroy the temple, and somewhere that ark of God exists, but it's gone. And nobody knows where it is. All of the furnishings they may have been melted down for all we know. God may have it in a cave in Afghanistan somewhere. We don't know where it is. It may be sitting in heaven with God. We don't know where that item is, but it's not in Israel. So on Yom Kippur of this year, The same Jews, the descendants of the Jews who rejected Jesus Christ, who still have not come to faith in Jesus Christ, they will gather on the 10th day of the 7th month of this year, according to their Jewish calendar, and they will celebrate Yom Kippur. And according to the Bible, the Day of Atonement was a day when the high priest would take his garments, would be fully fitted in his uniform, and would go behind the Holy of Holies, behind the veil, to sprinkle the blood of Israel, to take away the sin of Israel for yet another year, the national sin. And what is there for them to sprinkle onto now? How can a Jew possibly believe that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is still an active God, Yahweh desiring ceremony, when they have no temple, they have no Ark of the Covenant, they have no high priest, they have no ephod, they have no blood of the animal? None of the structure of this day is in existence on earth. What do they have? They have the same promise that we have. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved. They have the same Savior we have. They just simply continue to reject Him. Even though their worship system has been completely annihilated off of earth, they still hold on to the fact that Jesus is, or to their heresy that Jesus isn't the Jewish Messiah. But David called for the ephod. In his great faith, he calls for the ephod. And one more verse here. This is the ephod, by the way. This thing that goes over the blue robe, and the ephod held onto it by these gold chains and clasps. This breastplate, it had 12 stones on it, one stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and inside the flaps of that breastplate, this thing that looks like satin, inside there, behind these stones, were these two stones called the Urim and Thummim. That's what David's after. That's why David calls for the ephod. David doesn't want to wear the ephod. David wants to find out from God, what do you want me to do in this battle against the Amalekites? They've taken our families. Should I pursue them, Lord? I have messed this up royally. I'm not going to depend on myself any longer. I'm not going to think I can go with the Philistines into battle and everything's going to be okay. I've messed this up. I got men that want to stone me instead of follow me into royal leadership. I've messed this up. What will you have me to do today? And so David turns to God in humility. Exodus 28, concerning this ephod, it says, you shall put in the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim, stones, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord, into the temple, into the tabernacle. And Aaron shall carry the judgment. These stones, the Urim and Thummim, were meant to give God's decisions about things. How it worked, nobody knows. We're not told exactly how it worked. But we know that somehow through these stones, God would give a yes or no answer. Aaron shall carry the judgment of the sons of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually. So one more verse in 1 Samuel 30, verse 8. David inquired of the Lord, using the Urim and the Thummim of the ephod's high priest's ephod, which he had with him. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band, these Amalekites? Shall I overtake them? Are you going to give me my wives and children back, and these men their wives and children back? What should we do? And God answered David. Isn't this different? Because Samuel tried to get a hold of God, or Saul, tried to get a hold of God, and God what? Didn't answer him. The contrast between two men. God answered David. And he said, pursue. You get up and you go. Pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. Again, what a contrast between David and his father-in-law Saul. God answers David. They have an ongoing personal relationship, but God was silent with Saul. That's why Saul turned to the witch of Endor and tried to find Samuel, bring Samuel back from Sheol. David, in his faithfulness to God, another leadership characteristic, humility. Humility. Who would want to have to grovel up to God and say, Lord, my goodness, I can't imagine. I could never have imagined how big a mess I could create in just a few days. But I have almost destroyed myself entirely by having these men raise up against me. The men that you gave me to lead now want to stone me. And in humility, he comes before the Lord and says, what's my next step, Father? I'm tired of doing this on my own. I'm tripping all over myself. You ever feel like that, Christian? I'm tripping all over myself trying to get ahead of you. I'm going to wait on the Lord. You tell me what to do. Humility. We've seen three: empathy, faith, and humility, and we'll pick up here next time.